Every driver who reaches the top of Formula One is supposed to leave the simulator behind, treating it as a training tool for rookies and a hobby for retired names with time to burn. One driver never got that memo. A reigning world champion currently sits inside the top 3 simulator racers on the entire planet, and no one at the pinnacle of real motorsport has ever done that before. Why does a man who spends his weekends lapping at 300 kilometers an hour in a $200 million factory car come home and log onto a computer game against strangers and somehow beat almost all of them too? The two worlds are supposed to be separate. Real drivers are supposed to struggle in the sim, and sim specialists are supposed to struggle in the real car, because the two disciplines draw on different senses entirely. That assumption holds for almost every driver who has ever tried to cross the gap. It does not hold for this one. The answer to how he broke that rule sits inside a single practice lap at one of the most dangerous circuits on the calendar, and inside a technique so specific that even the engineers who watch him do it still find it strange. Bathurst rewards nothing but precision. The circuit rises and falls across a mountain, narrows to barely a car's width in places, and punishes the smallest error with a wall that does not move. Inside an online endurance event on that circuit, a Red Bull driver posted a qualifying lap 4.5 tenths of a second clear of the next best time in the world. In a real car on a real day, 4.5 tenths gets swallowed by wind, by a change in track temperature, by a rival catching a better toe. Inside a simulator, none of that exists. Every driver faces the identical grip, the identical air, the identical empty circuit, which means 4.5 tenths stops being a gap and becomes a canyon. The same driver lined up 4th on the grid for a virtual running of one of endurance racing's most famous races and turned that into the lead before the field had even cleared the first chicane. He then extended the margin lap after lap against a field stacked with professional simulator racers, current Formula 2 talent, and drivers who had won the real version of that same 24-hour race. The gap kept growing until a server failure ended the session early, which is its own story for later. He was, for as long as the race lasted, simply gone. None of that should be possible for a driver who spends his actual working life driving completely different machinery. The sim and the real world resemble each other closely enough to fool a casual glance, but they are not the same discipline wearing two different costumes, and the difference shows up hardest in the final tenths of a lap, the exact tenths that separate a good lap from a great one. Plenty of drivers who are unquestionably fast in real machinery have climbed into a simulator rig and found the walls faster than they found the apex. Stepping into a sim strips away senses a driver has trusted for an entire career. The pull of real cornering force through the body disappears. The sound of a rival's engine closing from behind disappears. The three-dimensional read of closing speed that a driver builds up over thousands of real laps collapses into a flat screen unless the driver invests in a headset, and even that comes with its own list of compromises. The in-car audio never quite matches what a real engine sounds like from inside a real cockpit. There is no gravity pulling at the organs in a corner. There is only a wheel, a seat, and a picture. The most important sense of all is feel, and feel is the hardest one to fake. A real driver can sense a tire beginning to slide underneath them, can read exactly how much grip remains corner to corner, can adjust in real time as fuel burns off and rubber wears down, and the balance of the car shifts by degrees too small to see, but too large to ignore. Simulator steering wheels do produce force feedback, and modern force feedback has become genuinely impressive, but replicating what a driver feels through the base of their spine in a real chassis remains an unsolved problem. Here is where the technique comes in, and it is stranger than it sounds. In the sim, this driver turns the engine sound almost completely off and turns the tire sound almost all the way up. What comes through the headset afterward is a grinding, scraping noise that most people would find unpleasant. That noise is how he tracks exactly how close his tires sit to their limit, replacing the physical sensation he would normally feel through his body with an audio signal he has trained himself to read instead. Other elite simulator racers use variations of the same trick, rerouting missing senses into the ones the platform can actually deliver. That workaround exists because so many of the fastest simulator racers in the world have never sat in a serious race car at all. They learned to go fast using fewer senses from the very beginning, adapting their technique to a world with no G-force and no engine roar to lean on, which means the deficit runs in both directions. Take one of those simulator specialists and put them in a genuine race car. And the missing trust in the chassis becomes the new problem, the thing that has to be built lap by lap in a way no simulator session can shortcut. Real seat time teaches a driver to trust a car in a way no screen ever will. Simulator time teaches precision without ever teaching that trust. This driver is crossing that gap from the opposite direction, and he is far from the only current Formula One name doing it. Several grid regulars keep active simulator profiles, chasing lap times against strangers who have no idea who they are racing, until the results sheet reveals a very famous name near the top. He is simply the one who has pushed furthest into serious, competitive simulator racing while still winning championships in the real car, and after winning a real Grand Prix in America, he was spotted back in an online lobby only a few hours later. The way he actually drives inside that simulator carries his real-world identity with it almost unchanged, and that consistency itself deserves a second look before the climax of this story, because it explains exactly how those record-setting laps came together. His approach to wheel-to-wheel racing online mirrors his approach in a real cockpit almost exactly. In one online endurance event, he threw a driver wide at a chicane in a move that would look entirely familiar to anyone who has watched him wheel a real Formula One car, nosing narrowly ahead and forcing the other driver to yield ground rather than risk contact. The move stayed inside the rules and drew no penalty, which is precisely the tightrope the very best competitors walk in any form of racing, pushing right up against the boundary without stepping over it. The same aggression that makes him electric also makes him vulnerable, and that vulnerability matters, because a story built entirely on triumph without cost stops being believable. He leaves almost no margin anywhere on a circuit, using every available inch of track surface and committing to overtakes that would make a more conservative driver flinch, and that has caught him out before it ever paid off. In one online endurance race, he ran so much curb through a chicane that a rendering glitch launched his car into the air and threw him straight into a barrier. In a separate online sports car event, he attempted a bold pass around the outside of another competitor, forcing that car slightly wide, and the resulting contact put him into the wall a second time. The mentality that wins championships is the same mentality that occasionally ends a session early in the sim exactly as it does on a real circuit. None of that erases what makes the technique work. A teammate at his simulator racing team described what separates him from almost everyone else on the platform, saying that what makes him so strong is how dynamic his driving becomes, that he can climb into a car that feels genuinely impossible to handle and still send it beyond the limit, and that nobody needs to ask him to push, because pushing to extract absolutely everything a car has to offer is simply built into how he operates. That adaptability gets tested constantly, because inside the simulator he is almost never driving anything resembling his actual Formula One machinery. He races GT cars, prototype-class endurance cars, and junior single-seaters, each one demanding a completely different driving style, and the GT cars punish the wrong habits hardest of all. Those cars carry more weight, generate far less downforce, and include driver aids like traction control and anti-lock braking that a Formula One car simply does not have. A single-seater with heavy downforce rewards braking as hard as possible at the very start of a braking zone, and then trailing off the brake pressure as speed falls and grip returns, because locking the tires becomes a real risk once the downforce has bled away. A GT car with anti-lock braking rewards something closer to a steady 80 to 90% of maximum brake pressure held through the braking zone before easing off into the corner, extracting the most out of a very different braking system entirely. Getting that technique wrong in either direction costs real lap time, and switching fluently between the two within the same racing week is its own separate skill that has nothing to do with outright bravery. Watching him actually drive reveals just how completely he has absorbed the differences between these categories while keeping his fundamental approach untouched underneath them. Modern Formula One cars across recent regulation eras have rewarded drivers who blend braking, turning, and acceleration into one continuous motion rather than three separate actions, and the best drivers on the grid execute that blend so smoothly it reads as a single fluid gesture rather than three distinct inputs stacked together. He adjusts the specifics of that blend depending on which category he happens to be racing inside the simulator that week, but the underlying habit stays constant. He uses every available inch of track surface, and the biggest gains in his lap time come specifically on corner exit rather than corner entry, extracting more speed onto the following straight than almost anyone he lines up against. Setup preference tells the same story from a different angle. During one Formula One season, his own real car ran with mild understeer early in the year, meaning the front end resisted turning in and the car pushed wide on corner exit, a balance that suited his teammate far better than it suited him. He gravitates instead toward a car that turns in sharply and rotates eagerly through the corner in the simulator exactly as in the real world, which explains why he favors mid-engined GT cars over front-engined rivals, since a mid-engined layout rotates through a corner more willingly. A car that wants to rotate that freely is also a car that punishes a clumsy pair of hands, because losing the rear end becomes far easier once so much of the car's weight has shifted onto the front tires under braking. And only an extremely refined feel for where the limit sits allows a driver to live on that edge without constantly crossing it. He reads the exact moment a car begins to slide and holds it just below that threshold, and when it does slip past that threshold, he corrects it with inputs so small they barely register on camera. Tiny corrections of steering or brake pressure that calm the rotation without killing his cornering speed. That is precisely how a car built to rotate freely turns into an advantage rather than a liability. And it is precisely why his corner exit speed keeps outrunning almost everyone else on the same server, in the same session, in the same lap. All of which circles back to that lap at Bathurst that opened this story, and to the question of how a reigning world champion ended up 4.5 tenths clear of the best simulator racers alive on a circuit built to punish the smallest mistake. The answer was never a mystery hiding somewhere in exotic equipment or a secret setup file. It was a driver who rebuilt his missing senses into ones a screen and a headset could actually deliver, who carried his real-world aggression and his real-world setup preference into a discipline most people treat as a separate hobby, and who refused to treat the gap between the two worlds as a wall rather than a bridge. The gap between simulator racing and real racing has swallowed plenty of very fast names before him in both directions, and it will likely keep doing exactly that to the next driver who assumes the two disciplines are simply the same skill, wearing a different costume. He is currently the only reigning world champion sitting inside the top 3 simulator racers alive, and nothing about how he got there depended on shortcuts. It depended on turning down the engine, turning up the tires, and trusting a sound most people would switch off immediately. Will another driver currently on the grid ever close that gap? Or does this stay a record that belongs to one name alone? Let us know what you think in the comments below.